Streaming from Abbey Cat Recording Studio in Chicago.
You are listening to Influenced, a podcast where we explore what makes great music influential.
Look around, see what you do. Everybody smiles at you.
All right, welcome to the next episode of Influenced. My name is Blake Sokoloff,
And I'm Robert Dean.
and this week we're doing Light Orchestra and kind of by extension of that, Jeff Lynne. He's had a very large career in the music industry, producing everyone from Roy Orbison to Tom Petty to actually the Beatles. He's had quite the storied career, and he definitely gets a lot of his start and a lot of his kind of know-how from his time with his band ELO.
Yeah, huge amount of creativity with ELO in the 1970s when it all started for Jeff Lynne and his co-founder of ELO, Roy Wood, who actually only lasted about 2 years with the band. But they had this big idea of doing pop music. It's around 1970. Doing pop music with an orchestral background.
They were into the fact that by the end of the 60s, like, rock was expanding a little bit. Like, they were very influenced by, like, the Beatles and the Beach Boys and
The Moody Blues.
And the Moody Blues and bands like the Hollies and things like that. Like, a lot of those kind of British rock bands that had sort of also started to kind of use the studio as an instrument in and of themselves. Mm-hmm. And Roy Wood and Jeff Lynne had actually been playing music together kind of throughout the last few years of the 60s in a band called The Move,
right?
Which is actually where I think they actually ended up meeting a few of the other guys that they would eventually draft in to kind of be the other permanent, to some regard, members of ELO. I mean, Jeff Lynne is kind of the only permanent and consistent member of Light Orchestra, but the keyboardist Richard Tandy has also been around for a number of years and continues to play with them now. And Bev Bevan as on kind of drums and percussion. The two of them have kind of been around since kind of the end of the days of The Move and kind of the very beginning of ELO, because when it started out, it was very much like a kind of rock band. Like, I'll play a track here off their very first album real quick, just called 10,538 Overture. So it's got quite the sort of heady name. They were sort of in the space of their band. They were inspired a lot by like the beginning of what would kind of become prog rock and things like that, where songs were getting kind of long. Like, a lot of the songs were over 5, maybe even 6 minutes long. And there was also a lot of studio experimentation outside of just your typical rock band instrumentation. Like, it wasn't just bass, drums, guitars. They were doing a lot of overdubbing with classical musicians or just session musicians and things like that. But here's the Light Orchestra for this first album, No Answer, 1971.
So that song in particular drew some attention, their debut album. But when you listen to it, it sounds a little raw to me.
Definitely,
when you compare that to like their 1975 album Face the Music and
certainly.
Evil Woman and Strange Magic, it really sort of punctuates Jeff Lynne's growth as a producer.
Definitely.
In just like 3 or 4 years.
Definitely. Like I'll play a few bars of Evil Woman here real quick off their 1975 album Face the Music. And this is one of their bigger hits. I mean, this song has almost 50 million plays on Spotify, so it's definitely stood the test of time as one of their seminal tracks. And you definitely get to hear the kind of expansion into like Jeff Lynne really knowing how to use the studio, because like in that first song on the 10,538 overture, you can hear like the beginning of like working in some cello and some things like that in the studio, but it's kind of all just in this big rock band mush. Whereas like over the years since that first album, Jeff Lynne really figured out how to arrange everything so everything kind of had its own space in the mix and in the songs and within the music. And part of that sort of raw feel might have been a little bit attributed to Roy Wood. I know he was a bit of a cellist in his own right, so he was probably playing some of those cellos and things like that.
Right.
And when you've got one of your main band members kind of doing some of those parts, it can be harder to get them to play a certain way than it could be to bring in a session player who can be like, if the session player is not playing cello the way you might totally want it to suit the song, you can kind of be like, hey, just play it a little differently. Where if it's a whole band member and you're trying to get them to suit the song, some tensions can arise and maybe Roy Wood didn't last much longer after that first album, so I don't totally know too much. Jeff Lynne doesn't talk about their relationship that much these days, but there might have been some tensions between the two of them, kind of wanting to push the band in different directions. And you do have on that first album, you do even have Roy Wood like singing some lead vocals on it, almost half the album, which is the only real, other than like the occasional spot. Like later on, we're going to talk about the Xanadu soundtrack with Olivia Newton-John, which does have one or two occasions of Jeff Lynne not singing lead vocal on a track, but other than that first album, Jeff Lynne has pretty much sang the lead vocal on almost every ELO song since. So I do think that kind of tells you that he was kind of the leader of this band and kind of what really wanted or the driving force behind this sound. So that I know that was a bit of a tangent, but here's Evil Woman from Face the Music, and just really pay attention to the difference between the orchestration and the arrangement between just that first track from their first album, Overture, and Evil Woman off Face the Music.
Okay, so right there you can really hear Jeff Lynne had ELO extremely polished by 1975.
Definitely. I mean, like, just comparing like the just kind of clunky cello in that first song to the way the strings are so well and nicely arranged in that song is just like a testament to the improvement that Jeff Lynne had as a producer and as an arranger and songwriter in just a few years. Like, it's really just a couple years since that first album.
Yeah, I mean, that's her fifth album.
Yeah, exactly.
They came out, Jeff Lynne and ELO came out with, I think, 6 albums in 5 years. I mean, just a really quick, production, and his just production capability just continued to just flourish.
The kind of taking those strings in like that is definitely like is one of the biggest things that he wanted to do with ELO as a project, and kind of taking that classical excursion. And I want to kind of play, it's going back an album or two, but but I do want to kind of highlight just like one of the most famous kind of uses of classical music and sort of ELO's discography has got to be like the way they actually they covered the kind of famous Roll Over Beethoven Chuck Berry song, which is kind of just like a standard rock and roll track. Like the Beatles have a very just straight rock and roll cover of that song, with George Harrison on lead vocals, but ELO decided to cover that song and actually intersplice in some of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, which I'm going to play a few seconds of here real quick. Just like one of the most famous classical pieces probably of all time, with one of the most kind of iconic intros of any classical piece, really. So I'll play a quick recording of the Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, taken from a 2014 orchestral recording. But here is Beethoven's Fifth in C, just for a few seconds, just before I play the ELO Roll Over Beethoven. But here is Beethoven's Fifth, just for a second. So obviously one of the most kind of iconic pieces of classical music that probably still exists in the music canon these days. Here's Roll Over Beethoven, the Electric Light Orchestra version off their second album, Electric Light Orchestra 2 from 1973. And this is the last album to feature any contributions from Roy Wood. He's only on one or two songs on this album. He's definitely not a co-frontman like he was for the first album, but this is the last album to feature any contributions from Roy Wood, from 1973, Electric Light Orchestra 2, Roll Over Beethoven.
Great example of Jeff Lynne just rocking it out.
But rocking it out with almost a whole orchestral backing, which is kind of definitely not something you see every day, and definitely one of the things that made ELO unique, especially in the early 70s. And like, I mean, this isn't necessarily maybe the most unique thing about Jeff Lynne's musical, I guess, influences, but to say he was influenced heavily by the Beatles,
no doubt,
given that everyone, especially from the 70s to 90s, is heavily influenced by the Beatles. But I do want to just kind of highlight real quick, like, especially like a lot of the later kind of era Beatles, like once they kind of got to the point where they were actually incorporating a lot of classical music kind of a couple years before ELO would really get into the mix. But like once the Beatles really settled down and all, kind of along a lot of those White Album and Abbey Road and Let It Be era Beatles cuts are very, very influential to Jeff Lynne's songwriting, and Jeff definitely just like the way that he approaches music and kind of arrangement and everything like that. And Jeff Lynne definitely in kind of later in his career, which we'll touch on in just a few minutes here, he actually got to kind of the chance to work as a producer with a number of the Beatles, and actually working with the Beatles themselves for their anthology project. But I do want to just real quick here want to play The Long and Winding Road off of the Let It Be album. This is actually from the 2021 kind of remix that the Beatles recently released for the album, which features some great remixes, and you can really hear the string parts on these songs even in more high definition than you probably could before, and remixed entirely by George Martin's son Giles Martin. Here's The Long and Winding Road off the Beatles' 1970 album Let It Be, remixed for modern day listening in 2021. But here's The Long
mix. It sounds amazing in Abbey Cat. And, Jeff Lynne and ELO, I mean, they went through this patch of time, 75, 76, 77, where he came out with Face the Music, A New World Record, Out of the Blue, and just in rapid succession.
Yeah.
And sort of took the UK and the US by storm.
Definitely. A New World Record was kind of the biggest they had ever had on the charts. Like Living Thing, Telephone Line, and Do Ya all did very well on the charts. And Telephone Line was actually I believe, top 10 hit in both the US and the UK, which was kind of a big deal at the time for a band to get like a top 10 hit. That's the same song from the same album and both the US and the UK charts, which actually hadn't really been done by too many artists since the Beatles, given that like the Beatles had by this point been broken up for about 5 or almost 6 years now. So I'm going to play Telephone Line here off of A New World Record. And you can really hear, you can hear that kind of influence of that late era Beatles, that kind of Paul McCartney style of like bringing in a lot of those string players and horn players and things like that. And also A New World Record and the next album, Out of the Blue, he starts getting into a lot of the more kind of cutting edge musical technologies at the time, like getting into some sampling and some tape loops, like on Telephone Line. In the song, there's actually some samples of just telephone lines and things like that.
Yeah.
Just actual sounds from the world that Jeff Lynne just brought in a phone to the studio and recorded it and things like that. So he was definitely starting to kind of play with sounds and things like that. And also starting to experiment with some things like vocoders and the beginnings of synthesizers and things like that. So they were definitely, in addition to continuing their kind of quest to use the best musicians in terms of just like amazing classical performances and things like that, they were also starting to get into some studio trickery and some of the more modernized kind of music practices that have since been perfected in the kind of the decades since. And they were definitely one of the purveyors of a lot of these effects and a lot of these sounds. So here's Telephone Line off the 1976 album A New World Record.
Yeah, you can really hear that Beatles influence on Jeff Lynne big time, and kind of playing that back to back. It's really helpful to hear it.
Definitely.
And you can also hear, starting to, whether later bands wanted to admit that they were influenced by Jeff Lynne and ELO or not. But you can start to hear influence on later bands like XTC, maybe the Dandy Warhols.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I'll play a XTC song. Honestly, I would say there's a fair amount of like sonic influence between like even some of the more like famous XTC songs, like even just Making Plans for Nigel.
Yeah.
You can hear a lot of like that kind of almost Baroque pop sound from like ELO. So I'll play here just Making Plans for Nigel off the 1979 album Drums and Wires. Off by XTC here. So here's Making Plans for Nigel. And you can definitely just hear that very kind of like it's upbeat, but it's also still like a little bit of like they're kind of almost in your face about the production of the songs. Mm. Here's Making Plans for Nigel by XTC from 1979.
And if young Nigel says he's happy, he must be happy. He must be happy, he must be happy in his world. We're only making plans for Nigel.
Yeah, hearing some ELO blood kind of pumping through the veins of XTC there.
Definitely. I mean, especially in like the way the drums sound. Like I'm gonna play "Turn to Stone" off of Out of the Blue. We opened with Mr. Blue Sky, kind of the biggest hit off this album. So I'll play "Turn to Stone," not to double up too heavy, but the drum sound, especially on that XTC song, just gave me a very, very heavy vibes of like this kind of Out of the Blue era and kind of Discovery as well era ELO drum sound, where it sounds very big and very cacophonous, and you've got that kind of reverb kind of coating almost everything. And also the vocals of that XTC song sound very, very similar to, in my opinion, so the kind of the way that Jeff Lynne kind of places his voice over a lot of those ELO songs. That's kind of like, it's almost, I mean, it's almost, I guess I'd say kind of kookier parts of the music is always the vocal with Jeff Lynne, because he doesn't necessarily have the straightest kind of Paul McCartney smooth voice or anything like that. He kind of, but he knows how to put his voice over that kind of music, but it's not definitely not like a Roy Orbison or a Paul McCartney kind of vocal. But and that definitely, I definitely feel that with the XTC as well. But I'm gonna play "Turn to Stone" off of Out of the Blue from 1977 here, the opening track from Out of the Blue actually. But this is ELO's "Turn to Stone."
You mentioned their 1979 release called Discovery a few minutes ago, and Discovery was a huge album in the UK and the US for ELO, one of their top two albums. And definitely, I mean, from an influence standpoint, they picked right up on the big bass sound of the late 70s.
Definitely sort of their sort of disco influenced album.
Question.
Like you can definitely hear like a lot of the Bee Gees. Like I'll play Nights on Broadway real quick here off of the Bee Gees album, 1975 album, Main Course. And you can really hear that kind of reliance on like the big bass and the kind of synthesizers and things like that ELO was really kind of expanding into as it got closer and closer to sort of the turn of the decade into the 1980s. But here's Nights on Broadway off of the 1975 album Main Course by the Bee Gees.
Yeah, Brothers Gibb with the big disco sound of the mid to late 70s, mid 70s there. And I think you'll probably be able to find something on Discovery that'll kind of sound a little bit like that.
I mean, I'm going to play the track Last Train to London, which is one of the bigger singles off that album Discovery. It's kind of Last Train to London and the other big hit Don't Bring Me Down.
Yeah. Both
of which ended up being some of the biggest hits that ELO would have in their whole career. And definitely very like probably the grooviest the band ever tried to really be on a record, and definitely like the most tuned into like disco and kind of that pop rock sound. Like this is definitely the album where only one song on this ELO album actually goes over 5 minutes, which is kind of a first for any of theirs. Like ELO 2, the shortest song on ELO 2 is 6.5 minutes long. To go from that in only like 5 or 6 years later, like 3.5 minute to 4 minute pop rock tracks. So here's Last Train to London off the 1979 ELO album Discovery. And you can definitely hear that very heavy bass and kind of keyboard and synth sound being experimented on with by Jeff Lynne and company here with Last Train to London. So here you go.
It was one of those nights, one of those nights when you feel the world stop turning. You were standing there, there was music in the air. It should have been away, but I knew I'd have to stay. Last train to London, just heading out. Last train to London, just leaving town. But I really want tonight to last forever. I really want to be with you. Let the music play on down the line tonight.
You know, ELO's influence kind of coming out of that style of music, you know, impacted a lot of people, influenced a lot of bands. One that comes to mind is Daft Punk.
That sort of like that very disco influence, but still kind of classically indebted sound is definitely something that like influenced a ton of artists, especially a lot of more modern artists as they've kind of started to come back around to that music of those years. And I'm going to play like a track off of Random Access Memories, the 2013, at the moment, the last full-length LP from Daft Punk. But this song is just called Give Life Back to the Music. And you can really hear that, like, that combination of disco with some, like, very heavy classical inspirations and things like that, like some nice strings and things like that kind of popping up and out throughout this the whole album of Random Access Memories. But Give Life Back to the Music is a great kind of track that kind of ties all that together. And this song actually also features Nile Rodgers of Chic kind of on lead guitar as well. And that's definitely like a contemporary of Jeff Lynne's, kind of from that era of music. Like Chic and ELO were definitely musical contemporaries and things like that. So it definitely kind of lends itself to that kind of time period and that kind of frame of music. So here's Give Life Back to the Music from the 2013 album by Daft Punk, Random Access Memories.
Give life back to music. Music gives you light. Spin on the music and the music of your life. Give life back to music.
Jeff Lynne kind of famously was one of the first, like you heard it in our kind of opening track, Mr. Blue Sky, but Jeff Lynne was one of the first, actually kind of I think the first like kind of major charting artist to use a vocoder in any sort of pop music fashion, which definitely kind of snowballed into, 30 years later, Daft Punk kind of coming onto the scene with their whole robot sound. And of course we will also want to talk about Jeff Lynne's production career, which is kind of the thing he's most notable for outside of his work with ELO. And he's been in demand as a producer, and also Jeff Lynne sort of by the early 80s seemed to kind of he kind of lost his luster for the band, it seemed like, for a while.
He was over it for a long time, actually.
He was kind of over the whole, I think he was kind of over just like the touring and working with the same group of 4 or 5 musicians for the most part. So he really just wanted to kind of get into production and get into things like that. And kind of thankfully he made a lot of friends in the music industry and was fairly in demand as a producer. So he kind of famously ended up starting that side project and kind of one of his other bands, the Traveling Wilburys, with Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, and George Harrison, kind of one of the biggest lineups of any supergroup, maybe the biggest supergroup lineup in music history. But kind of between a lot of those guys, he kind of made a name for himself as a producer. Like I'm going to play real quick here, just a song, You Got It, off of the album, the 1988 album, Mystery Girl. This album was actually kind of the resurgence album for Roy Orbison's career for a few years. He had kind of faded into sort of obscurity in the early 80s, just kind of playing the oldies circuit because he had been like a big 50s and 60s kind of rockabilly country guy. So he was obviously like a big influence on Jeff Lynne in the early years of his career. So when Jeff Lynne kind of found out, oh, hey, Roy Orbison's looking for a producer, I want to actually kind of take him in, and I bet I could kind of make him famous again. And that's essentially what Roy Orbison did. He brought in a couple of his other musical friends, like on this track, You Got It, he actually co-wrote the song with Tom Petty, and Tom Petty does some backing vocals. And so Jeff Lynne was definitely kind of flexing his musical relationship muscles by the mid 80s. But here's You Got It, kind of one of the songs that kind of began a very long string of production collaborations for Jeff Lynne. So here's You Got It off of the 1988 album Mystery Girl.
Anything you want, you got it. Anything you need, you got it. Anything at all, you got it, baby. Every time I hold you, I begin to understand. Everything about you tells me I'm your man. I live my life to be with you. No one.
Oh man, nothing better than a Roy Orbison vocal. But you could kind of really hear there, it had that 50s, 60s Roy sound to it, but in more contemporary type of way. It kind of
definitely, yeah.
He just Jeff Lynne kind of figured out how to like blend the past with the present in a way.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it's a lot of that. Like Jeff Lynne is kind of known for a lot of the synthesizers and drum machines, and he knew to kind of stay away from that when he's working with like a 50s guy like Roy Orbison, but he could still do those really big, thick, layered acoustic guitars and the really great sounding drum set and things like that. So it definitely took a lot of what made Roy's original music so iconic, and also just kind of brought him into the modern world for a lot of the late 80s and early 90s fans, and kind of brought him a whole new lease on his career for the last few years of his life. Yeah. And kind of one of the I guess the most notable sort of first project that Jeff Lynne, this was actually this production was actually before the sessions for Mystery Girl, but the Cloud 9 George Harrison solo album that Jeff Lynne kind of produced, and which kind of which included this hit, I Got My Mind Set on You, which I believe was it might have even been number one, but it was at least a top 10 hit for George Harrison, which was again kind of a thing that hadn't happened for George since the early 70s. Like there had probably been 5 or maybe even 10 years since George had really been on the charts by 1987 when this album was coming out. But this was a major hit for George Harrison and kind of revitalized his career as well. So Jeff Lynne sort of began to get a reputation as someone who could kind of revitalize careers of like a lot of rock and roll guys that had maybe had what they thought was their kind of day in the sun. Right. But here's Got My Mind Set on You from the 1987 album Cloud 9 by George Harrison.
But it's gonna take money, a whole lot of spending money. It's gonna take plenty of money to do it right, child. It's gonna take time, a whole lot of precious time. It's gonna take patience and time to do got my mind set on you. I got my mind set on you. I got my mind set on you. I got my mind set on you.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff Lynne brought big drums, upfront vocals, big sound to George Harrison. Gave him a big hit.
That album definitely has a lot more at the time modern production than maybe that Mystery Girl album did as well. Like Jeff Lynne was definitely getting into his drum machines and his synthesizer collections, working with George Harrison, who was maybe a slightly more modern artist at that point. And I want to also kind of touch on probably what would become probably Jeff Lynne's most notable production kind of partnership. Just probably this album specifically is probably the most notable album outside of his own work that Jeff Lynne was involved in the production with. But Jeff Lynne was also in that kind of at the turn of the decade in 1990, Jeff Lynne was the co-producer along with Tom Petty and Mike Campbell for Tom Petty's first official solo album from the Heartbreakers, Full Moon Fever, even though it ended up kind of being a Heartbreakers album with Ben Mont and Mike Campbell playing on at least most of the songs. So I'm going to play obviously the biggest hit off this album here, Free Fallin'. Like I think everyone and their dog kind of knows this song, but it's definitely Jeff. I mean, this song is actually also a co-writing credit between Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty, which is a kind of a special relationship. Like Jeff Lynne wasn't necessarily co-writing with George Harrison or Roy Orbison as much. I mean, they were all co-writing together when they were together with the Traveling Wilburys, but on their own, Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty had kind of a special writing relationship that fed them a lot of hits, like I Won't Back Down, Free Fallin', Running Down a Dream are all Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne co-writes. I mean, Running Down a Dream is with Mike Campbell as well, but even still, they had a very fruitful kind of production and songwriting relationship, and it's honestly probably where both Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne got a lot of their chump change for the next 20 or 30 years after this album came out.
Yeah, for sure.
But here's Free Fallin'.
And it's a long day living in Reseda. There's a freeway running through the yard, and I'm a bad boy, 'cause I don't even miss her. I'm a bad boy for breaking her heart. And I'm free, free falling. Yeah, I'm free, free falling.
Well, I think we're giving our listeners a pretty good idea of where the Traveling Wilburys came from.
I believe the way kind of everything fell together was George Harrison was kind of finishing up the project that he had been working on after that Cloud 9 album, and he had been working with Jeff Lynne for that album, and George Harrison's record company was like, all right, we want you to release want you to do a B-side for some single or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So George is like, all right, I kind of have one weekend to come up with a B-side. Hey, Jeff, let's get down to the studio and do a B-side.
Uh-huh.
And since they didn't have much time to kind of get this session together, the only studio that they could kind of both get to was Bob Dylan's studio, because Bob Dylan on his kind of estate had like a pretty state-of-the-art recording studio, because by the late 80s, I think Bob Dylan was kind of like, he liked recording and liked having a recording studio set up, but he wasn't necessarily, he kind of just wanted to do all of it himself. Like, he didn't want to have to go out, find a studio wherever, and he had the money and the resources to actually put his decent studio together. So Jeff and George are kind of like, all right, let's do this session at Bob's studio. And then Jeff has the idea to go be like, all right, what if we got Roy Orbison in on some backing vocals?
Mm-hmm.
And George Harrison was super into that idea because it's Roy Orbison on backing vocals.
Right.
Like, that's one of the better vocalists in
Ever.
probably rock history. And so allegedly on the way to the studio, George realizes that the guitar he wanted to use was at Tom Petty's house. That's the story allegedly. That's the story Tom Petty would tell in interviews and things like that. So they meander on down to Tom's house on the way to Bob's. And Tom's like, oh, yeah, you can have the guitar as long as I can come to the studio. So that's allegedly the genesis for how Traveling Wilburys were born. But I'm going to kind of play real quick here, Handle with Care, the song that ended up coming out of that initial writing session of the Traveling Wilburys that
Cool.
Then George took to his record company and they were like, we need a whole album of this, essentially. So that's essentially where the Wilburys came from. But here's Handle with Care from the 1988 album Traveling Wilburys Volume 1. So here's Handle with Care.
I'm so tired of being lonely. I still have some love to give. Won't you show me that you really care? Everybody's got somebody to lean on. Put your body next to mine and dream on. I've been bumped up and I've been fooled. I've been robbed and ridiculed in daycare centers and night schools.
Definitely a super cool, unique project for those guys, and another great producing effort by Jeff Lynne.
Definitely. And I mean, I don't know if that's ever something, a group like that at least will maybe not ever happen again, where that many musicians with that amount of kind of musical history and everything behind them coming together for a couple almost kind of random albums. But that kind of project definitely sort of cemented, I think it cemented both Jeff Lynne and Tom Petty as kind of like the greats among the greats. I mean, it cemented those two, in my opinion, as artists who were kind of supposed to be in a group with other artists of that kind of Bob Dylan, George Harrison caliber. So I definitely think that was a kind of major thing for sort of the last half of Jeff Lynne's career, and also just like the his legacy and just the way that kind of people take him seriously. Like he's kind of in the last, like, I think kind of the last 15 to 20 years, he's kind of become a pretty interesting figure for a lot of newer musicians. Like I know Brandon Flowers from The Killers has talked about a lot in interviews about how ELO and Jeff Lynne were very major influences on kind of The Killers, and when they were kind of finding their style for the sort of last half of the Killers' career. Like their first few albums were very post-punk and 80s and 90s rock inspired, but for the last like 4 or 5 albums of their career, they've sort of taken it back to some of the more kind of classic rock and kind of orchestral and pop rock influences like ELO and things like that, and other kind of massive stars have also kind of talked up Jeff Lynne's influence. Like Ed Sheeran has also talked a number of times about how Mr. Blue Sky is one of his favorite songs growing up and things like that, and how he learned a lot from listening to ELO as a kid and what his parents were showing him and things like that. And I actually think you can probably find it on YouTube. I don't exactly off the top of my head remember what the performance was for, but I know there's a performance somewhere online of Jeff Lynne and Ed Sheeran actually performing together, and they end up doing Mr. Blue Sky and maybe 1 or 2 other ELO songs that I think they maybe spliced together with one of his kind of more modern pop tracks. I kind of want to leave, I guess, the Jeff Lynne episode with one of the probably to Jeff Lynne the biggest production gig he ever got, which was working with Ringo Starr, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney on the Beatles anthology projects, both Anthology 1 and Anthology 2, kind of specifically working with the three of them to complete a couple of the demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love, that John Lennon had actually demoed before he passed away in 1978 to 1979. and actually given to Yoko as kind of like a give these to Paul McCartney, eventually kind of some tapes. And when the Beatles anthology project started in kind of the mid 90s, they were looking for a producer to kind of help them finish up those last two songs. And George Martin, their kind of regular Beatles producer, had just gotten to the point where he was a little too old. Like his hearing wasn't what it needed to really be to be in the studio with the rest of those guys finishing those songs. So kind of because of his successful work with George Harrison and things like that, Jeff Lynne was chosen as the producer to help those guys finish those projects or finish those songs. And you can really hear, you can hear the production style. The songs sound amazing. They sound very modern. They're definitely the two most modern Beatles productions in terms of just like the way they sound. And Jeff Lynne did a great job of putting his kind of sonic signature on the songs while also keeping them very Beatles-esque. Like you can tell they're nothing. No one could make those songs other than the Beatles, but still the drum sounds and the kind of some of the guitar work and things like that are very reminiscent of some of Jeff Lynne's production and things like that. So he definitely left his mark on these Beatles tracks. And I think to him as a musician who started out as one of the most influenced by the Beatles of any of those early 70s artists, for him to kind of be able to actually work with the band that kind of made him a musician is probably a pretty cathartic thing for Jeff Lynne, and also was a very successful endeavor for Paul, George, and Ringo. And I think John would probably be very happy with the way the songs turned out. So here's "Free as a Bird," the Anthology 1 version from 1995. And I think that just about closes out our Jeff Lynne episode of Influence. So thank you guys for tuning in.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I've been Blake Sokoloff.
And I'm Robert Dean.
And this has been Influenced, recorded here at Abbey Cat Recordings and over in Chicago. And here's "Free as a Bird" by the Beatles and Jeff Lynne. So thank you guys very much. Have a great one.